So shall we begin? All right. Well, I just wanted to welcome everyone, certainly our panelists, but also all of the attendees. And this is a special event in that we've been doing these Art of Global Protest series since fall. We began with a conversation around Belarus. We talked about yellow vest protesters in France and Belgium in January. In February, not just 2 weeks ago, actually, we talked about the connections of Black liberation movements all over the world. And today we moved to South Korea. Our colleagues are actually coming to us from Central Washington University. And I think that it's notable in that sense because we are so lucky to have these three individuals here with us at Central Washington University. Which really is important for us to kind of begin by sort of taking a moment to consider the fact that Central Washington University does sit along the land of the historic home of the Yakima people. So the federally recognized Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation are made up of the Klickitat, the Palouse, the Walla Walla, the Wanapum, the Wenatchee, the Wishram, and the Yakima. The Yakima people remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it and protecting it as instructed by elders through generations. And we are deeply honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. We give thanks to the legacy of the original people, their lives, and their descendants. So I just think it's very important that we begin that with that acknowledgement. And I also want to take a small moment to talk a little bit about the Art of Global Protest series, of which this panel is a part of. There have been many communities throughout the world speaking truth to power, and we're going to hear about that today. And we're going to continue this into the spring quarter. We're going to hear about Puerto Rico, most likely April. We haven't got a firm date for that yet. And we're lining up panel for May as well, possibly centered somewhere in the very large continent of Africa. We're very indebted to Dr. Volha Isakova, who's down here with us, to really come up with the creative mind behind all of these panels. So thank you very much. Also thank you to your department, World Languages and Cultures. And of course, we must thank the Office of International Studies and Programs for sponsoring this event and others, as well as the Office of the Provost. So I'm actually going to turn everything now over to Volha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hope. And thank you to the Museum of Culture and Environment, Hope Amundsen, Lynn Benke, and Frank Jones for helping us establish those webinars, running them smoothly and doing great PR for this series. So now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists who will discuss South Korea's Candlelight demonstration of 2016-17. The organizer of the panel, Dr. Chong Yunan from History Department, will provide insights in understanding the Candlelight movement in the history of mass movements in South Korea. Our next speaker, Dr. Yoon-Young Lee from the Department of Communication, will explore the rhetorical characteristics of protests, focusing on the case of Park's impeachment. And finally, Dr. Seokhoon, also from Communication Department, will introduce the role of media in framing the protests in the case of Park's impeachment. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you organizers for making this event come to light. Preparing for this was a meaningful journey. As Dr. Volha Isakova just mentioned, I will be briefing the Candlelight protests in 2016 to 17's position in South Korean history, while leaving legacy part a little open for the audience to think about at the end. Okay. Okay, so before I start talking, let me share 7 minutes of this omnibus documentary film called Candle in the Wave to give you a timeline and share some scenes related to the topics that will be brought up later in the talk.
Seas had rise when I gave the word. Now in the morning I sleep alone. Sweep the streets I used to own. I used to roll the dice, feel the fear in my enemy's eyes. Listen as the crowd would sing. Now the old king is dead, long live the king. 1 minute I held the key. Next the walls were closed on me, and I discovered that my castle stand upon pillars of salt and pillars of sand. I hear Jerusalem bells ringing, Roman Catholic.
제 대통령직 임기 단축을 포함한 진퇴 문제를 국회의 결정에 맡기겠습니다.
It was the wicked and wild wind blew down the doors to let me in. Shattered windows and the sound of drums. People couldn't believe what I'd become. Revolutionaries wait for my hand on a silver plate, just a puppet on a lonely string. Oh, who would ever want to be king? I hear Jerusalem bells ringing, Roman cavalry choirs are singing. Mirror, mirror, my sword and shield, my missionaries in a foreign field. For some reason I can't explain, I know St. Peter won't call my name ever alone this word, but that was when I ruled the world.
헌법재판소는 오전 11시 박 대통령 탄핵 심판 사건에 대한 21번째 재판을 열고 탄핵 여부를 선고하게 되는데요. 탄핵 여부 결정 이후에 그러니까 이제 뭐 인용이냐 아니면 이제 기각이냐 각하냐 이에 따라서 박 대통령의 향후 거취도 상당히 다를 텐데 헌법재판소 앞에는 이미 새벽부터 탄핵 인용을 요구하는 시민들 그리고 반대를 외치는 친박단체들이 모여서 지금 시위를 벌이고 있습니다. 현재 앞 상황 알아보겠습니다.
피청구인은 대국민 담화에서 진상규명에 최대한 협조하겠다고 했으나 정작 검찰과 특별검사의 조사에 응하지 않았고 청와대에 대한 압수수색도 거부하였습니다. 이 사건 소추와 관련한 피청구인의 일련의 언행을 보면 법 위배 행위가 반복되지 않도록 하여야 할 헌법 수호 의지가 드러나지 않습니다. 이에 재판관 전원의 일치된 의견으로 주문을 선고합니다. 주문, 피청구인 대통령 박근혜를 파면한다. 이 결정은
박근혜가 대단하다고 저는 생각해요. 저같이 이렇게 정말 보수 성향이 강하고 이런 사람들이 하루아침에 저 혼자만 아닌 것 같아요. 많은 사람들이 아마 생각이 바뀌지 않을까. 솔직하게 제가 대구 살았잖아요. 그러니까 보수적인 성향이 깊잖아. 그러니까 속으로 이런 생각했어요. 아, 나라에서 하는 일인데 그러고 안전하다 하니까 받아들여야 되지 않을까. 그랬는데 제가 생각이 바뀌게 된 계기가요. 대단한 날이 있었어요.
국가의 안위가 어렵고 국민의 생명과 신체가 위태로운 상황에 처해서 국가로서는 이에 대한 대비를 할 수밖에.
사람들이 좀 흥분한 상태에 있는데 제가 그 자리에서 무슨 이야기를 들었느냐 하면 우리 국민 보고 빨갱이라 그러고 외부 세력이라 그런다는 소리를 들은 거예요. 그 자리에서. 제가 막 제 길을 의심해서 이거는 좀 아닌데? 여기는 아무도 없는데. 그때만 해도 외부에서 온 사람도 없었고요. 정말 없었어요. 저는 제가 눈을 직접 봤잖아요. 내가 내 눈앞에서 일어나는 일을 직접 봤는데 그거랑 다르게 있잖아요. 기사가 쓰이는 거예요. 그러면서 다른 타 지역의 사람들의 느낌이 같이 올라오잖아요. 아닌 거예요. 거기서 제가 느꼈어요. 아, 5.18이 이때 이랬구나. 제가 5.18일 때요. 우리 군이 그 북한 계리군을 무찌르기 위해서 계엄령을 선포하고 땡글을 앞세워갈 수도 있다. 선생님이 이렇게 말했어요. 저는 그거를 고등학생이었으니까 30년 이상을 철딱같이 믿고 있었는 거야. 아무리 국회에서 있잖아요. 5.18 그 민주화 방송을 할 때도요. 제가 그거 별로 안 봤어요. 신경 안 썼어요. 그랬는데 내 눈앞에 있는 현실을 딱 보고 5.18 딱 그 순간에 떠오른 거야. 이거 아니다. 이거 뭐지? 그때부터 이제 공부를 하기 시작했죠. 사드란 무엇인가. 그리고 다른 언론들과 조중동을 비교하면서 기사를 보기 시작한 거예요. 그러면서 제 성향이 급격하게 바뀐 거죠.
언니랑 비슷하긴 한데 세월호 터졌을 때는 솔직히 저는 괴롭긴 한데 많이 외로웠거든요. 나 혼자 좀 안타까워하는 거 아닌가. 사람들은 뭐 아무렇지도 않은데 근데 첫 집회 딱 했을 때 사람들도 나랑 같이 느끼고 있고 내가 나 혼자 외로워할 필요가 없구나.
살면서
Okay, so historical context before the 2000s in South Korean history. So when the World War II was over, the Korean peninsula got divided into two by the decision of the leading Allied powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Allied powers conferences at the end of the war stipulated that trusteeship would be applied to some of those former colonies in order to reorganize the societies in the decolonization process. So US forces arrived in the South in September 1945, same with the Soviet forces in the North. So Korea got divided. Hostile leaders supported by these two big powers on both sides held separate elections in 1948. Leading to the Korean War. While the ceasefire happened in 1953, the division got systematized, and this division system pretty much has defined the South Korean high politics and even daily lives of the people. It hardened its anti-communist system represented by the national security law, in my opinion, which is above the constitutional rights of a person. Kim family in the north completed its dictatorship using 주체 ideology, which is also known as self-reliance ideology, and revolutionary tradition, which idolizes Kim family as the family with this tradition within. In South Korea, unlike many of our common perceptions, its days before 1987 were tainted with dictatorships. Syngman Rhee, who was the favor of US occupying forces and also Washington, D.C., manipulated election processes, censored media, surveilled people to sustain its regime for 12 years. After his resignation at the age of 85, military coup by Park Chung-hee led to a military dictatorship in 1961. After his death in 79, Another military personnel led a coup in 1979 and led dictatorship for another 7 years or so. So in opposition to these powers of occupation and dictatorships, many struggles flooded in South Korean history, and the democratization movements lay at the core of these multiple struggles. First, challenges to the regime in South Korea started early on in its history as the occupation by another force and division was not what people had expected after the liberation. From the Japanese Empire. I mean, many nationalist elites and even local representatives had already established their own committees planning and preparing for independent nation state. Struggles both underground and on the streets continued during this time as some yearned for independence, reunification, also starting to express their left-leaning or right-leaning political tendencies. But that moment of revolutionary fervor was shut down by the US occupying forces and anti-communist Ri regime. Yet Ri regime's election fraud and corruption led to daring protests on the streets in the spring of 1960, especially after a dead body of a high school student after being tortured, found in a port city of southern part of South Korea. Mass movements against this corrupt and dictatorial regime spread it all over South Korea, and Ri had to step down. Then after a moment of democracy, Park's coup led to dictatorship again, which led to multifaceted struggles of the people. And according to Professor Choi Jang-jip, who is a political scientist, political cleavages in South Korea between 1960 to 80 could be understood as a faction with multiple forces yearning for democracy, economic justice, fair distribution, and reunification versus those who were supportive of this authoritarianism and dictatorship as they were leading economic growth. Before 1980, though, we don't see this kind of yearning for democratization being solidly allying one another with one another. A loose alliance of dissident movement against Park's rule existed, with some focus on the student movements and Christian churches playing a big role. But it was actually in 1980, during the Gwangju massacre, this kind of loose alliance met a turning point and led to more alliances with among the people against the military dictatorship that came to light again in 1980 under Chon's, Chon Do-hwan. So we see this mass movements becoming more becoming more solidified after Gwangju massacre, which leads to 1987 struggles that democratized elections, and some constitutional changes were made after this struggle. But after this 1987 struggle, civil society led to diverse movements among the peoples, not simply left or right. Even among the progressives, there are different areas of focuses like labor or peace, reunification, or women's rights movements, and etc. But before I go into post-1987, I wanted to share how important Gwangju was to the people on the streets in the 80s and afterwards. So after Chong came to power, it was met with lots of challenges. People wanted some sort of democracy after Park's death. So it's called Seoul Spring, and in response, Chun shut down the universities and announced martial law. This is anti-martial law protests in Gwangju in May of 1980. In response to that, a special warfare brigade was sent to Gwangju to basically suppress the movement, and hundreds of people died during the May of 1980 in a southern city, Gwangju, in South Korea. Yeah, but as I mentioned, even after the so-called democratization in 1987, there still are moments when mass struggles against decisions and political powers that are deemed anti-democratic, imperialistic, or injustice, that continue. And candlelight vigils and protests in the 2000s portray those mass struggles. The very first large-scale candlelight vigils held in South Korea was in 2002 to commemorate and protest the death of two teenagers, Hyosun and Misun. They were killed by the US military vehicle as American soldiers in that vehicle were training on the highway. They hit the two girls, causing immediate deaths. But that death was saddening to the people and it angered the people, but it was actually the South Korea and US's status of the forces agreement, also known as SOFA, what provoked these people or encouraged these people to be on the streets from June 2002 to April 2003. US had sole jurisdiction over the incident, and the drivers of the vehicle were pronounced innocent almost immediately in 2002. And the reason why this continued even after the decisions were made was that the Bush administration asked the South Koreans to send troops to the Iraq war in 2003. And so this moment continued into anti-war protests in the spring of 2003. And the next one is in 2008, after the mad cow disease being reported in 2003, South Korea, along with many other countries, banned imports of US beef, but there was gradual changes to that. Relaxation of beef export from US to South Korea happened. But in 2008, when the new administration came into power in South Korea, and the president's name was Lee Myung-bak, who was a former Hyundai Corporation CEO, he wanted to open free trade agreements with the United States, focusing on car export to the US. US Congress wanted beef exportation to South Korea. So that decision was made, and that also angered the people that they don't get to know where these beef was coming from, or the safety, public health was concerned by many people. And the peak candlelight protest in this 2008 US beef protest was in June, and it had about 1 million people on the streets. The next one, next candlelight vigils, has something to do with ferry sail drowning while its route from Incheon to Jeju in the morning of April 16th, 2014. Out of 476 passengers and crews, 304 people died in this disaster, including 250 students from a high school as they were on their way for a field trip. And more than half of the survivors were rescued by fishing boats and other private vessels nearby. Coast Guards arrived late, and the president at the time did not appear anywhere for some time until the late afternoon without any explanation. Yeah, and during the ferry disaster, tremendous trauma spread. Media was reporting people, including many high school students, dying scenes, their screaming scenes, as their cell phones were sending video recordings of them drowning and messages of love to their families and friends. Individual divers who came to the scene to rescue also testified how some students tied their bags together, showing their last-minute friendships, how some older people delivered little kids while drowning to death, and etc. But at the same time, the conservative media's blaming of only the crews and the ship operating company, while leaving questions about the administration's incompetency in making immediate and effective responses, led to many criticisms. Yet that criticisms were met with media censorship and control, blacklisting of scholars and politicians, and also conservative media still trying to use the communist or anti-nation framework to portray those people who challenged the rule, were all leading to another revolutionary movement in 2016. Many of us know through English written media that Choi Sun-sil, who was like a shaman, who was a daughter of a pastor who believed to have supernatural power, influenced the President Park Geun-hye, and that gate was what led to the impeachment of Park. Yes, true, in a way that it influenced people's anger, and the incompetency, level of incompetency of that administration was really infuriating the people. But I think many people still remember in Gwangju, the massacre, feeling guilty about the weakness of the people at the moment, and experiencing Sewol Ferry disaster again, which led to Candlelight and Yellow Ribbon movement. And still meeting suppression of these criticisms concerning incompetency actually led to this revolutionary movement in 2016 to 2017. So I think there is an intricate relationship between traumatic past activism and the revolutionary movements in South Korean history. Okay, so these are some pictures of global solidarity. This is actually in Seoul, the top two ones. That's not really international in any sense, but the ones in the bottom are from Paris and Seattle, mainly organized by Korean diasporic groups. But since I won't be discussing the legacy much, and since this is part of the Art of the Global Protest series, I wanted to share that the Candlelight movement led to more engagement with global matters among civil societies in South Korea. Candlelight protest songs, organizing methods were often brought about in Japan's anti-Abe protests, Hong Kong umbrella protests, and Hong Kong umbrella protests. In Korea too, some of those civil groups learning about other injustices outside of their country got strengthened, through the Candlelight protest experiences, and they are now showing their supports of the movements in outside of Korea. This one, it's pretty obvious. It's Stand with Myanmar recently, and this is a solidarity declaration of Korean students and youth with Thailand. And this is Belarusian revolution recent from last year, and this is Black Lives Matter. So we see like global solidarity being built through this experience of revolutionary movements or progressive movements. Let me conclude here now by sharing my final slide that has the protest theme song from 2016. Thank you for bearing with me thus far, and let me toss the attention to Dr. Eun-young Lee.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here real quick, and then I can start my presentation. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. An, to set the whole political, social, and cultural context so well, so that I can do my own presentation here, which is more focusing on the Korean impeachment rhetoric, the characteristics of the rhetoric in relation to the case of the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. So my title of my presentation is In their Gwangjang. Gwangjang means the square in Korean. So today my presentation is the three main agenda that guides my presentation as the effort to examine and understand and interrogate the rhetorical characteristics, how the Korean presidential impeachment brought about, these are the three points that I like to cover. And I'm going to start with the impeachment in the Constitution, and then I'm going to move on to the concept of square, 광장, again in Korean. 광장 means the square. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to delve further into the very characteristics, the Korean political cultural characteristics regarding the impeachment case of the former President Park Geun-hye. So the reason why I like to talk a little bit about the impeachment in the Constitution is because as a person who's Korean, who's born and raised in Korea, and then moving to the United States, and then living here for the most of my days of years, and one of the rare cases that I got to hear something about South Korea was around the time when the presidential impeachment in the United States were also happening, because like you were seeing from the Dr. An's presentation, the impeachment protest and the Park Geun-hye's impeachment was so provocative and sensational. And then in the United States, when the United States was also going through the process of the presidential impeachment, that's when I also got to hear the mass media in the United States were mentioning where we need to learn something from the South Korea, how they brought about the justice back to their democracy. So my question starts with what counts as the impeachable. So especially one of the architects of the United States Constitutions, George Mason, his question has been quite often mentioned when in the history of the United States were facing this moment of presidential impeachment. And George Mason asked, should any man be above justice? Where the obvious answer here is no. No man can be above the justice. But the reason why I like to bring this back to this conversation when it comes to the impeachment or the public discourse of impeachment is because that very question is at the core of what kind of things that are the biggest concerns when it comes to the power, how the power should be in check, so to speak. So the very reason of having the clause, the idea, the notion of impeachment in the Constitution in the first place was to prevent the abuse of the power. So the Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution reads, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And throughout the history since then, these are the cases that happened that impeached in the United States. And except the Nixon's case back in 1974, none of them were actually forcefully removed from the office. And even the Nixon's case was, he resigned right before he was getting impeached. And here the ROK stands for Republic of Korea. ROK Constitution, the clause for the impeachment in South Korea's constitution reads very similar to what I just read for you, the Article 2 of Section 4 of the United States Constitution. So throughout the history of ROK, since the constitution was in place back in 1948, there has been two cases so far. So the first one was back in 2004. The then President Roh Moo-hyun was impeached, which he got acquitted from the Constitutional Court. And the last and the most recent case of the presidential impeachment was the topic of today's talk here, Park Geun-hye, and she was impeached during the 2016 and and the early part of the 2017. And as you heard from Dr. An's presentation, she got removed from her office. And the picture here on this slide is what you can see, the one of the protests that was happening in the Gwanghwamun Gwangjang back then. And the reason I'm going back to this, historical moment of the impeachment in both in the United States and in South Korea is because one of the things, especially around the most recent cases of the presidential impeachment, and one of them we just got done with it a month ago, the Donald Trump's case. And one of the things that I've been noticing, and we all have been witnessing about the public discourse around the presidential impeachment, was it's either framed and perceived as political games only between these different political parties or among politicians. But as I've been, reiterating what the impeachable counts as, it's really more about the morality, the justice, the abusement of power. Those are at the core of this idea of the impeachment, which brings me to this great conversation. There was a rhetorical scholar, Celeste Condit, back in 1999. She said, to the extent that dominant elites control the means of communication and the public vocabulary, they can represent singular or partisan interests as universal or moral ones. They can thereby evade the modifications, compromises, and larger goods brought through agonistic competition between values and interests. Dominant elites thus hijack the moral potential for partisan end. And that's exactly how especially the most recent presidential impeachment public discourses has been primarily framed, so that the people who are the agent, who should be the agent of the democracy, they felt very powerless. They felt as if the impeachment is just a political game, not really so much about bringing the justice back and bringing the really genuine sense of morality back, especially to the power, for the power and for the people. And one of the things that Condit here really emphasizing is that this sense of the public morality can be constructed through the collective discourse. And what creates and engender that kind of collective discourse is public rhetoric. And in that public rhetoric, a sense of identification is a crucial element, so that in the through the public rhetoric, the sense of the shared moral cause can be created. So what Condit highlights is that those shared moral cause that can be created and reinforced is inductive and locally derived. And this kind of conversation really gives us the better idea to understand the the Candlelight protest in Gwangjang. So here, the picture that I have on this slide is the picture of the Gwanghwamun Gwangjang. And when we were seeing that short clip at the beginning of this panel, the area where the stage was being set up is exactly where you see right here. And then here, another rhetorical scholar, Beecher, he coined this notion of rhetorical situation. So the exigency, the people, when the people decided to, and almost forced to come out the street, come out to the Gwangjang, come out to this square, there was this sense of exigency and about the abuse of power. They were feeling very powerless because of this, unreasonably assigned power to the president back then. So this sense of the corruption of the political corruption or economic corruption, which all goes down to this sense of the immorality that was really ripe within the society. That's what basically pushed these people come out to this street and the Gwangjang, the square. And this is again the picture where the Candlelight protest back in 2000, throughout the 16th and 17th was happening. So here, as we saw during Dr. An's presentation about the Candlelight protest in South Korea, especially since 2002, the people in Korea, they have experienced how to bring the protest to the street, out to the square. So there they had this sort of experience and the memory of how their activism can brought about, and as a part of the collective transformation, as a way of the collective transformations. So here I like to focus a little bit more to the concept of the Gwangjang. Gwangjang, like I said, is the Korean word for the square. And the picture, the sort of the old map that you can see on the top of the slide here is the map of the Gwanghamun Gwangjang area from the back in 1930s. And as you can see here, you can still see the sort of very resemblance of that area that you can see even nowadays. And that's where exactly the protest, Candlelight protest for the president impeachment was happening. So here the square should be understood as the public space which is becoming the public sphere. And here, the rhetorical scholar Hauser also introduced and elaborates this notion of rhetorical public sphere. And what he means by this rhetorical model of public sphere is that public sphere is the discursive space which is the locus of emergence of rhetorically salient meaning regarding the matters of mutual interest. So what Hauser suggests here is that by interrogating the process by which rhetorically salient meaning are created and embodied, that can help us decipher the persuasive force of identifications in that process. And also another part about the reason why we need to also look into the Gwangjang as the public space, which is the public sphere, is the bodies of the people. You've been seeing these pictures that the massive volume of people are protesting in the square, and their body, the body of each individual is a testimony of their own traumatic experiences, the traumatic experiences they had to bear through, they were suffered from because of the injustice, a range of the injustice that can manifest in very various ways in their own lives. So in that case, the body of each individual, the body of the people who were protesting in the square, their body is a dissenting medium. So these conversations, again, really bring us the ways to more deeply or more culturally understand the Korean impeachment rhetoric, especially in the case of Park Geun-hye's impeachment. So here, one of the notions that I like to introduce to explain how this particular rhetoric of Korean impeachment was constructed or engendered is the notion of a minjung. Minjung in Korean literally means the people, but it means more than that. So here, throughout the history of the uprisings, the protests and social movements in Korea, and we got to hear some of the momentum from the Dr. An's presentations, and the minjung, the people of Korea, their identity, their subjectivity in these protests, especially in the Candlelight protest, is the political identity. Their subjectivity is, as a minjung, they are the rhetor of that impeachment rhetoric as a collective agent, and they were able to act as their political identity because of these memories of Minjung, which goes back to this history of the uprisings that they had to do whenever they were facing this, various kinds of injustices throughout the history of South Korea. So here, Nancy Abelman, she is the anthropologist who actually went to South Korea to study the social movements, the characteristics of social movements in South Korea. And she said memory posits a repository from which mobilization draws. And this really speaks to the people, the Minjung in Korea, because of the memory, the collective memory from their history about social injustice and political injustice. And how then, what is exactly the sort of the force that brings these people together as a Minjung and really brings their political identity out of each individual? What is the persuasive force for their own identification? Here, I like to introduce another concept of Han. Han in Korea means basically this deep sorrowness, deep sadness, and sort of the feeling hopeless almost. And because of the traumatic experiences they have to bear in their life. So Han can be the pathos, the sort of the emotional base of the Minjung. So it really comes from different manifestations of injustice in these people's life, which leaves very trauma for them. But what I like to really emphasize and highlight as part of this notion of a Han that is working as sort of the persuasive force for their own identifications among the people is, yes, it is the memory of trauma, and that's based on very traumatic experiences of each person. But at the end of the day, what they are really going for, what they are really desiring for, is the desire for transcendence. Yes, they were suffered, they were, having this deep sorrowness and sadness, but that's exactly the kind of the motives that really drives them to overcome whatever the social, political, economical, or cultural obstacles they had to deal with. And I think these are the important aspects to understand in order for us to understand the Korean impeachment rhetoric. And all this goes to my last point here then. What does all this means for our democratic society? What I mean by our democratic society, I don't mean only for South Korea or only for the United States, but really for all of us. What does it mean for our democratic society? And I keep going back to this, idea of civic consciousness and the morality, and that the idea, the highlighted desire and hope for civic consciousness is exactly what is at the core of impeachment in the first place. So what I like to discuss further after our presentation is done today is how this conversation can help us create more, some ways to build allianceship over the globe, not just in one country or not just in one small community, but how we can create the momentous moments from this. Thank you.
Okay, let me share my screen. Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining our panel today. My name is Seokhoon An. I'm an assistant professor of communication here at Central. And my presentation will mainly focus on the role of media related to Park's impeachment and protests. And I'm going to try to finish my presentation in 5 minutes so you can have enough time for Q&As. So throughout the protests, the mainstream news media paid attention to the issue at different levels. So the blue cells here indicate the liberal media, and the red cells indicate the conservative media. As you can see, the liberal media emphasized the importance of thorough investigations on the scandal and Park's responsibility, which reflected the protesters' voices, while the conservative media on the right cells, especially CS, 조선일보, one of the most radically conservative media, expressed their concerns about the divided nations due to the protests. And another interesting thing to note here is that the issues related to economy, as you can see in the last row, were mentioned most by HGR #1 and CS, and both are the most liberal and conservative newspapers. However, if you closely look at the messages presented, HGR criticized the corrupted relationship between Samsung and Park, while CS diminished the Samsung's involvement and defended Samsung, orienting the attention to the economy. That was so. Although they paid attention to the same issue, but their approaches were different. So here, these two sets of pictures show how mainstream media can distort the reality by partially presenting what was happening. Although the magnitude of the Candlelight protests was significantly larger than the conservative protests, the first image on the left side show the opposite. Similarly, as many of you might know already, the Candlelight protests stayed peaceful throughout the impeachment, while the conservative protests often turned into violent. But the pictures on the right side imply the other way around. So the media always try to be a gatekeeper on different issues and influence the public. But when people's voices are strong enough, the media fail to set the agendas but start resembling the truth. Yoon and Kim in 2017 studied the changes of the media coverages on Park's impeachment. So period 1, 2, 3, 4. And earlier protests initially demanded thorough investigations on the scandal of Park and Choi, then moved on to Park's resignation, which was followed by Park's impeachment. As you can see in period 1, earlier period, the liberal media, 1 and 2, reflected the protesters' voice on Park's resignation and impeachment, which was consistent. In contrast, the conservative media did not report the scandal much early on, and then as more and more people fill the street across the country and the various polls demonstrated an extremely high support for Park's step down, the conservative started to resemble the public's demands, yet emphasizing orderly resignation. I don't know what that means, but instead of impeachment, they emphasized orderly resignation. So moving from the role of the mainstream traditional media platforms to the rising of alternative media, social media, YouTube channels, and so on, this study done by Lee demonstrated how the audiences view each media channel based on their political views. What's interesting here is YouTube channels run by individual YouTubers here were most considered as the most credible source for conservative audiences and still relatively credible by the liberals. And what this infers is that people try to find an alternative media channel if the traditional news platforms do not provide the information that satisfy their appetites. Even if the news uh, the news source is presented by an individual who is not capable of providing credible supporting evidence, they will just continue to consume the channel. So in conclusion, media often try to set public agendas and how we should think about different issues by placing certain issues on their platform and showing distorted images sometimes. And during the protest, some media attempted to frame what issues were important, and they eventually, but the conservative media especially, eventually joined the people and reflected, somewhat partially reflected their voice. And I think this indicates that in spite of media framing, it is the people that determine how our society is moving forward. But the last slide, the last slide shows the changing trends of credible news resources. It also suggests that it is becoming more difficult for people to sort out which one is trustful news information and which one is fake news, unless they have critical thinking skills. And more and more people pursue alternative news resources as the traditional news platforms do not provide what they're looking for. And the rising of the alternative media makes it a little more difficult to deconstruct the oppression system. Even if one president is impeached or one corrupted police officer is arrested, and I think people's struggles against the oppression system still continue. Thank you. Dr. Han?
Thank you, Dr. Seokhoon An and Eunyoung Lee, for presenting really insightful ideas about impeachment and the media portrayal of the impeachment process. I think we all highlighted that it's important to take consideration the historical context, other factors than just visible elements in the revolutionary movements, but also the real thing is critical thinking skills, right? That's why we chose the conservative woman turning to read other liberal, both conservative and progressive newspapers and make her own decisions from then on, right? So, okay, so we are done presenting our own ideas thus far. But as a moderator, if there's anyone who is still listening out there among the attendees or panelists, what is your takeaway from today's panel? That's a general question, but I thought it was a good starting point. Oh, and by the way, Dr. Seokhoon An has another online training to attend in a couple of minutes, so we have to let him go. But yeah, thank you. You could see.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can type your questions in there. And I can start off with a question of my own. My question is, what kind of positive changes or lack of changes the Candlelight demonstration produced in Korean society and politics in the years after the successful movement?
Okay, can I go? And anyone else want to follow up, please? Okay, so I think I would not have presented something in this level if it was a couple years ago. As a historian, I feel like I had time enough to reflect while celebrating, but at the same time reflect on what happened in the aftermath. Democratization is a never-ending struggle, right? It's not going to be achieved at one moment for all, right? The power dynamics make it so complicated, and the current system in this global situation, the neoliberal capitalistic system, makes it even difficult for those who participated for democratic or progressive causes to be divided afterwards and, go for different directions, right? And the main problem I feel like after the Candlelight protest and the impeachment was, without systematic change, the labor rights are still very limited. The Congress, even with liberal politicians, are not passing those laws that bring justice to the workers in the factories and other businesses. And anti-discrimination law is not passing because that massive movement does not mean all these individuals in that moment shared same thoughts completely, right? They all had different thoughts. It was that moment, right? That public sphere and that scene, what created this power and made change, but that change is not for all either, right? Because those individuals in that moment were all not the same from one another. So I think it's really interesting to see how this is going, and the current president and the ruling party's supporting rate is going down because people are frustrated and disappointed. But at the same time, what can they do much right at this point? Can they just demolish the capitalist structure? Would that even what they want? Like, there are so many things, and I feel like as a scholar, activist-minded scholar, what I can do is call for more civil society movements to put pressure on the ruling party and the administration, rather than just being disappointed and frustrated and leaving the scene.
Can I weigh in? I think, like what Dr. An said, the pressure the people should put on the power is really important, and that's the whole point of this impeachment anyway. But what I am concerned is that the fact that Korea did impeach the president, that happened once, and that kind of caused in a negative way that we see this frequency of the presidential impeachment coming back to the public discourse, not just in the United States. I mean, it was bad here, but even in South Korea, the new president who came after the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, he also been, struggling with this ideas that that comes from politicians and the people too, that he needs to be impeached. And I don't think that's really necessarily a good way to go about to make the democracy works the way it should or it ought to be. But I'm really concerned that, and I also was reading other, the United States scholars who were also discussing the presidential impeachment. And even these people who were writing about the impeachment cases from the decades ago, they were giving us these warning signs that how easily the public or the public discourse can be created around the impeachment of a president whenever they feel like it. And that's exactly what we have witnessed just the last within 2 years. And I think that could be, although we need that system to be there, but at the same time, we need to be more cautious and careful about how to use it, how to use the power that's given to the people to actually make the democracy system works for the people.
Thank you, Volha, for the great question that ended up with our responses.
I think we have another question and another one. Two more. Okay. So this is a question from Anna Cairns.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for sharing about this time in South Korea. It was very interesting to compare the Candlelight protests there to the protests that have occurred in the US over the past couple of years. The most fascinating part about the movements in South Korea was the acknowledgement of the traumas of injustices that created the start of this movement. We often dismiss that aspect.
Dr. Lee, do you want to go first?
Well, thank you, Anna. And even though I cannot see your face, thank you so much. And I really am glad to hear that our talk here brought out this important aspect back to the public dialogue here. But I don't think this is really necessarily a question per se. It was more of the comments, I think. And I agree with Anna that yes, that part of the trauma of injustice. And that's, I think, one of the ways that we can see that can be applicable and that can create the moments for other communities here too. And when I was explaining the characteristics of the Korean impeachment rhetoric through the notions of Minjung and Han and the trauma and all that, I wasn't explaining that way to empathize that was working because Korean people are just awesome at to make the democracy works in a way that they should. I was not saying that. I was bring that out because I can also see different community, different area in the world, different countries and nations, they also have their own sense of the trauma that can caused by the sense of injustice due to the abuse of the power. There are different manifestations of the trauma people in different areas in the world had to suffer through because of the injustice. And I think that knowing that and thinking about that and acknowledging that the different community, different regions of the world do also deal with their own trauma on their own way could give us some sort of a creative insight how we can use that as the force to move the building of solidarity, not just in one community, but on the bigger scope of the global scope.
Thank you. I think that, responds really well. Volha, should we go to the next question?
Yeah, I can read it out.
Okay, thank you.
Next question is from Michael Johnson. Hi, Michael. Do you find that the coercive threat of being accused of communism or outside influence that dominated political rhetoric before 2017 has lessened since then?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like it because during, I think the next question is related to that too, that the Park Geun-hye regime had blacklisted scholars, artists, performers, and etc. And that caused like funding issues, scholarly freedom issues and all that. So I do see, yes, it has lessened since then, but at the same time, it has lessened since like 1990s, I would say. It was just back into power under Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye a little more. And there are more efforts to lessen that these days. I don't think it's an interesting dynamic to observe right now, but you can criticize President Moon so easily anywhere you want, the current president, and you can even talk about impeachment without any evidence, right? Like, so that's an interesting, moment to rethink about. And I'll just address the next question since I was talking about this censorship issue. Can you tell us more about the blacklisting of the Seoul ferry disaster? Who were blacklisted and what were the consequences those people faced? The movie, there was a documentary filmmaker who made a film about Seoul ferry disaster. Not many theaters would show that film. And the film festivals did not invite that film, even though it was widespread and gaining popular audience through other medium. So there was that. And for scholars, definitely like less funding for the schools you were working for, or yeah, and no awards coming from the Ministry of Education. Yeah, and since I have put my name all over when the Sewol Ferry disaster happened and when the impeachment of Park happened, I was on top because my name starts with A, my last name starts with A. I was on the top one of those scholars outside of Korea who wants impeachment of Park. And I was like, what am I doing? After learning that some of my friends were not getting any funding. But if you think about this, you know, not getting funding for a couple of years is not that bad. And as academics, we have power. You know, that's even more powerful to say such a thing. Like these days, a lot of people in Korea talk about how some professors were pressured. This has something to do with Park's impeachment too, that Ewha Women's University's professor took the daughter of Che, who was influencing Park, and gave her good grades and all that. And that became a huge scandal because it's in Korea, scores matter than anything else. So yeah, that became a huge scandal. And Ewha Women's University students actually went to the streets to protest that. And that led to, that one can say that that led to the impeachment. But you know, that professor made a wrong decision, now in jail. But if he used his power as a professor to not agree or not negotiate in that process, he might have gotten some funding decrease or something like that. He wouldn't have been fired because he was already tenured, right? So I feel like there are other ways to think about these censorships. Yeah, when some of us are empowered and entitled enough to make our own choices. Okay, that I don't know, it was a lot of rambling, but.
Well, I see one of the questions that comes from Matteo. The question is in regards to the impeachment. Was the president corrupt? Yes, she was. I can give you that answer directly. Or more what leads to the impeachment. Yes, we kept saying about this Sewol Ferry incident, and that was really one of the main thing that really brought this impeachment to actualization of it. And the sense of the corruption, the abuse of the power, or incompetence she had as the president, because she wasn't really competent enough to, she doesn't have the capacity of being able to be a good leader for the whole country. And one incident after another, it just came out and being unfolded in front of the very eyes of the people, realizing that, oh, she really doesn't know what she was doing. So, but in really in the at the bottom of that sense of incompetence, people realized about Park Geun-hye, the president during the time, was not because her sex or gender or her own, you know, family history. She was the daughter of one of the former president of South Korea, which Dr. An actually mentioned him during her presentation. Park Chung-hee, the one of the former president, he was the soldier, the general, and he basically was like a king. He made himself a king, although he claimed his government and his administration claimed to be a democratic government. But what he actually ended up doing was making himself a king, and he was in the position like longer than 10 years or something like that. But even by changing the constitutions of South Korea. And when we are talking about the corruptions or the abuse of the power of Park Geun-hye, who is the daughter of that guy, the former president, we are not talking about sort of this impact or possible, effect that was coming from the fact that she is indeed the daughter of the previous dictators of South Korea, but it was more about, like why as the leader, as the president of the country, where these kids who were in the Sewol ferry were dying, why you didn't do anything about it? Why you cannot even now tell us the truth about that day? Why you didn't do, what made you not be able to do some actual work to save those kids? They were dying and she was gone. She was not found anywhere. And they really fired people up about the sense of powerless. They, as the people, couldn't do anything really much, feeling so powerless, seeing these kids drowning and dying. But at the same time, like, where is our president? She should do something about this. She had that power. She had all the power that she could bring to fix the problem here. But she was not doing that. And that really, pushed people over the edge that this is not cool. This is not okay for us. So yes, to answer your question, yes, she was corrupt. And even now, we don't really know for sure because nothing was really came out, even when she was getting this verdict from the Korean Constitutional Court, and unanimously she was convicted. But even then, there was no information about where was her whereabout during that hours, even nowadays. So, well, yes, it's done. The impeachment was done, but would that mean that the Korean society, as a democratic society, became much better? Maybe not. But yeah, the history will let us.
But
know.
in the works, I guess, with that
Yes,
experience.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, next question. Laura. Hi, Laura. Does Han play, I think this is for Eun-young too, Han play a role in Koreans' tendency to hold candlelight protests, particularly for global issues such as Black Lives Matter? I think that's a tough question.
It is. Where, for many reasons, for many different reasons.
Han does, like collective trauma and memories around it, play a huge role in Koreans' tendency to protest. They protest all the time. The Gwanghwamun Square is always filled with people who are protesting for something. But for global issues, I think it's still minor, and it's really sad to say this, but it is developing. The voices are increasing. And the Gwanghwamun Gwangjang, one of the main buildings surrounding that square is U.S. Embassy. And there are always people protesting for something in front of that, for decolonization of Korea, like extraterritoriality of U.S. soldiers in Korea. Yeah, like war on reunification, like all those things. And it's really interesting how some younger generations are there too. I was amazed to witness those last fall, that there were like 20 like students, college students with their student association and club flags, like protesting in front of U.S. Embassy. And there were some for Black Lives Matter. But at the same time, South Korea has its own issues dealing with racial and sexual gender discrimination. So it's another, assignment that we need to look into.
Well, I can I can provide my own thoughts to this, although I do not have the answer for this for many reasons. The one could be what Dr. An was just saying. It's just really hard to really understand what's going on, why that is going on at the very moment that is going on. So I might need to, have some reflections on all this. Maybe years later, then I might be able to come up with some answers to answer this question more directly. But at this moment, what I can see, what I can try to elaborate is that I wouldn't necessarily say that the notion of Han is the motor for the Black Lives Movement that are occurring in South Korea territory for the moment. But what I like to point out is that that kind of sense could be the vehicle for the compassion. So for me personally, as a person who's born and raised in South Korea, living in the United States now, and I've been here in the United States for longer than a decade, which means I cannot be free from all those issues like racial issues or any kind of social justice issues that are big part of the United States culture and politics and society. And one of the things that I found myself as sort of this way, my own way to grasp what it would be like for the racial or ethnic minorities in the United States. And I wouldn't necessarily say that my Han was enabling me to understand other minorities' lives or others, those lives. However, that really helped me to even try, attempt to have some empathy or, try to put myself onto their shoes and see what it must be like. And I think that, that kind of at the source of the compassion, I think that's what I would like to see and think as the potential that kind of pathos really has for not just me, but for hopefully for other people too. And at this point, that could be probably the best response that I can give to Laura about that question.
Thank you. So the next question is by Maddie Rath. So I noticed a lot of similarities between these protests and recent American ones. One of my biggest concerns about the American society is the two-party systems, fighting rather than compromising or finding answers. Is this a concern in South Korea? Okay, should I go or do you want to go?
I can go first because my answer is short. Yes.
But at the same time, I don't think, they're always fighting, yes, for small to big matters. But that's not always a bad thing either, and we have more than two parties. So, but the two parties are the biggest parties, but we do have nowadays, I think last election, we had more than 20 parties with all these minor parties. And the third biggest party these days is more for justice of those racial and sexual minorities. And there are lots of labor parties too. And they're gaining some votes too. So which means while they're only like 5 to 10% popularity still, I think it means a lot for the people, that there are people who are listening to their various causes. So I think it's a different situation in South Korea. While the two biggest parties are always fighting, sometimes smaller parties play a huge role in policy making or putting political pressures. Okay, so the next question is Yoon. Hi Yoon, thanks for coming. So she has lots of reflection as a young Korean. I consider this peaceful candlelight movement more positively for the future, yes. However, the extreme right wings will describe this movement to how are they going to describe it? Already, my aunts and uncles are telling me, are you a red or not? By seeing my name on the list of protesters. And yes, will they sugarcoat or criticize this movement as rebel? It's already happening. I know you know that some of the right-wingers are already seeing this as like a communist revolt that was led by radical young people or radical Reds from the Gwangju massacre and things like that. And they are also calling for President Park to be released from the prison. They say I read this, that they say that previous dictators who led massacres were released after being in prison for a year or so. Why is Park Geun-hye still there for 4 years? But there are lots of court decisions that added up to her to be in there for 20 years, lots of embezzlement, and corruption issues. That's already happening, and long struggle ahead of us. Impeachment did not end everything. We have other struggles to continue. Okay. Thank you, Yoon. And hi, Geraldine. So is there a difference between the discourses of Koreans in the diaspora and in South Korea? I think I know why you're asking this question as a Irish living in America. Eun-young, do you want to answer this?
I think you are better.
Okay. Okay, so yes and no, because the discourse of Koreans in the diasporic communities also are diversified as it is in South Korea. But I do hear more conservative voices in diasporic groups, because especially those who are in the older generations. I have to say this, that I think more than 90% of Korean Americans go to Christian churches here, and the Korean Christian churches are rather conservative. Not all of them are, but most of them are, and they play a huge role in politicizing these elderly Korean diasporic communities' political positions. They play a huge role in lobbying for the discrimination law not passing, the anti-discrimination law not passing. They fund a lot of conservative groups in, like, right-wing groups in South Korea. So it's, I feel like we have to come up with a picture which one is more conservative. Definitely Korean diaspora communities in the United States, yes, they're more conservative. But recently I read in the newspaper, it's been 5 years, sorry, not recent, but the big city election votes from Korean diasporic communities, like in Shanghai, New York, San Francisco, their votes are rather liberal than conservative. That's what they even vote for very minor parties like the Justice Party or Labor Party, and they are gaining more popularity. These, like, left-leaning parties are gaining more popularity among the Korean diasporic communities in cosmopolitan cities. So I feel like that's a good sign.
Well, I can add a little bit to that, to piggyback on, although my feedback isn't the answer for directly about the Korean diaspora over the world and their sort of political tendency or their leniencies when it comes to that particular matters. But I think this also goes back to one of the earlier topic that we were talking about from the earlier questions about the sort of this conversation about the communism, the communist, that kind of a very dividing discourse that still exists in Korea. Yes, it does still exist in Korea. And so a lot of time it really surprising thing for me that, wow, even nowadays in 2020, 2021, people still call other people communist. And that's just so, and this is really the dilemma, one of the dilemmas that Korean, as the whole country and as the, the people really need to figure out, because as long as that, accusations, false accusations and very unnecessary kind of accusing other people for like political reasons that are not, that shouldn't be there, as long as that exists there, I don't think the South Korea or the whole Korea and the North Korea and South Korea, it will be really hard for them to come to the terms that would really work for the people, not just in South Korea, but in North Korea too, because eventually, although I'm not too optimistic about this, but eventually they would want to reunify the whole Korea. But if they kept having this kind of, public discourse about accusing each other as a communist, the kinds of conversation, really is not helping the reunification or even the, healthier version of South Korea democracy. It's not really helping them in any ways. And yeah, so like I said, I'm not, my feedback, my thought that was coming to me at the moment was not necessarily directly about the Korean diaspora in regards to this political, specific political agenda per se, but I think in a bigger picture, to understand South Korea and their minds, how their minds works, or how their political discourse has been structured. And I think understanding or trying to sort of, unpack that dilemma they have to come with the term is really necessary.
Okay. Okay, so the next question is, this might be a difficult one. Yeah. Why are events that occurred in Beijing in 1989 not referred to as China's Gwangju? I know the answer for this. Gwangju, if you're talking about Gwangju massacre or May 18th democratization movement, US hands are not clean. US has its own base like 20 minutes away from the heart of Gwangju. And, special brigades being sent to that region, it's almost impossible to say that the US forces did not know what was happening in Gwangju at the time. And there are many primary evidence to this too, that like missionaries and English teachers who were from the United States were in Gwangju. They were actually writing all about this, like asking help from their embassies and etc. So the so-called silencing of Gwangju was a global project from 1980 to 1990s, I would say. Even though there were some reporters reporting on Gwangju from Germany, Japan, and other places, generally the US-led side of in the Cold War were portraying this as like communist revolt being suppressed by the South Korean military. And yeah, I always start my discussion on Gwangju when I teach Gwangju with this comparison with Beijing as a Chinese historian, because Beijing was spotlighted all differently in 1989 at that moment and onwards because of this Cold War rhetoric. I hope that answers your question, Ireland.
And to piggyback on that, one of the most challenging things for us who pay attention to what's happening at the moment that's happening and come up with the better ways to understand what's going on is because, history, the time will tell us what this is going to be. And even for the Gwangju case in South Korea, it has not been called as Gwangju uprisings throughout the whole time. It was called in different ways. It was named different ways, which wasn't the way to,
Insurrection.
Right, yeah,
Insurrection,
there was no appreciation of the Gwangju protest or social movement as the people's efforts to make things right. So it just only recently, it was renamed and it was coming back to the public discourse as Gwangju uprisings. And I think this is the point I'm trying to make by introducing that sort of the history of the different namings of any uprisings or any social movements or any, I don't know, riot, I guess, is those namings and how those are being talked about itself is very political. And I think that should give us some ideas how to understand what island your question was asking us about.
Okay, the next question. Are there still Korean people who defend? I think I already answered that one. Yes. Yeah, they want to impeach the current of the president and bring back the conservative parties into power. Yeah, one excuse to defend the former president was that other dictators even got released. They're okay, they're living all right now. Why does she have to be in prison? And some people also just blame Che, who was the shaman who influenced Park. Park did not know anything. She's not responsible for all these corruptions. It was Che's fault. So yeah, there are many ways to many ways they bring up to argue their points. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's done. Last question, Coleman. Hi, Coleman. It's been years. Going back to an earlier question, would the portrayal of candlelight protests in Korean be somewhat akin to how kneeling during the U.S. national anthem, and are the protesters put into a no-win scenario like those that kneel during the anthem? Eun-young, do you want to answer?
The question is really mouthful. Okay, hold on. Let me think. The candlelight protest in Korea is somewhat akin to how kneeling during the U.S. national anthem. The protesters put into a no-win scenario like those that kneel during the anthem. Well, okay, so I'm not entirely sure if this no-win scenario had ever come across the minds of the people who were sitting out there, although I didn't believe that they were so naively thinking that this is going to be it, this is going to happen, we are here, we are voicing ourselves, we are speaking to the power, so this is going to be the way that we are envisioning. I don't think they really had that in a sense of their win is guaranteed because they are out there, they are sitting out there. But I think they were at least very optimistic in that they are doing what they should and what they ought to. So although that thing was guaranteed, if we are talking about win or lose, although I wouldn't really want to frame the whole thing that way with that kind of vocabularies, but just for the sake of arguments here to answer the question, not answering, but to give some sort of some thoughts back to this question. I think the people, they at least had this really sincere and genuine eagerness that they each basically on their hands, that they have no other places to go to make things right for themselves, and and that's the only way, that's basically the only option they had by that point, so that they could make things, right, and they can bring the justice, at least some sense of the justice, back to the people by the people. So I think that's really what drove them to keep coming out. I heard many of my friends back in South Korea, they were saying, and whenever they were talking about this, or the moments, the time they had to basically go out to the street, in the square, the Gwanghamun Gwangjang, and sitting there in the cold weather, they were feeling like that's pretty much the only option they got at that point. And that's really, that sort of the desperations, desperate, but that's eventually and ultimately what really brought them together, I think.
Yes, individuals who are on the scene may have had very vague ideas. They were not clearly thinking about win or lose results. But at the same time, I think it's really important that South Korea has a long history of NGO and nonprofit organizations' political engagement. And these organizers know how to collect these voices and empower them by organizing protests in front of the party offices or politicians' offices, gaining signatures and all sorts to bring their voices to the front. So I think while it was a little similar and different to the kneeling, they did not think of as a moment of victory. It was more of a commemorating or sharing sadness or sharing collective trauma for some sort of change, not being so specific. But I think there are many organizations, like civil society organizations in South Korea, that know how to address these issues and make them heard in the high politics. So I think, when the impeachment was announced, I was writing victory everywhere, because I was part of these organizations' calls for victory, right? Impeach her. We knew that there are other struggles ahead of us, but at least it was a stepping stone that ended this injustice, right? Corrupt and problematic administration. It was a huge stepping stone for many of us. And I think that answers Coleman's question about this comparison between kneeling and the scenario. Thank you. I think we responded to all the questions now. I posted this Candle in the Wave link. Please watch it. It's really powerful. It has many voices from street workers who are cleaning the streets when the protests were happening, to feminist voices, and just hearing those voices from the streets really is amazing. There are so many things to think about, from collective trauma, how activism works, who comes to these protests, what they're talking about. It's all amazing. Okay, thank you for having us today.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for providing access to this amazing documentary that is not available anywhere else. Take advantage. Watch it. Thank you very much.
Just to make it the documentary even more interesting for you guys, if you haven't had the chance to watch it yet. Personally, when I was watching the documentary, there were so many moments that I was just choking up. That was that powerful. That was very, moving. So check it out.
The first segment that we showed already was very moving.
All right. Okay, well, there's no more questions. We could wrap this up. Thank you very much to all the panelists and to Museum of Culture and Environment. and all our sponsors. And the Korean 311 class that came in full force. I'm looking forward to your reflections on the panel and the documentary.
Absolutely. And
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you all.